She was 7 months pregnant when her mother-in-law handed her a coat-check ticket at the door of the rehearsal dinner and said, in a voice warm enough to sound like kindness, "You can wait in the lobby, Miriam. Tonight is for family." The lobby of the Fairmont had cream marble floors and a chandelier the size of a small boat. Miriam Osei sat in one of the velvet chairs beside the entrance, her coat still on, her hands folded over her belly, and she breathed. Not because she was calm, because she had learned, a long time ago, that the only power available to a woman in a room where she is not wanted is the power of her own breath. Her husband, Colin, did not come out to find her. He had been standing 4 feet away when his mother said it. He had looked at Miriam for exactly 2 seconds, and then he had turned and followed his mother into the private dining room, where the rest of the Whitmore family was celebrating his younger brother's upcoming wedding. The doors closed. The sound of laughter came through them, muffled and bright. Miriam sat in the lobby for 45 minutes. A hotel attendant brought her water without being asked. He was about 19. He glanced at her belly, and then at the closed doors and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. She thanked him. He nodded once and went back to his station, and Miriam thought, that young man has better instincts than anyone in that room. She pulled out her phone. She did not call anyone. She opened the Notes app she had been quietly maintaining for 11 months and added one line. Rehearsal dinner. Fairmont, in front of the entire family. He didn't say a word. Then she put the phone back in her bag, placed both hands on her belly, and felt her son shift against her palms. She had a decision to make. Not tonight. The decision was already made, but the timeline had just accelerated. Her name was Miriam Osei Hargreaves before Colin convinced her to drop the Hargreaves entirely, because, as he put it, it was easier. Easier for whom had never been specified. She had been raised Miriam Adeze Osei, the eldest daughter of Kweku Osei, founder of Osei Capital Partners, a private equity firm headquartered in Toronto that had quietly accumulated, over 31 years, a portfolio of holdings that most Canadians used every day without knowing who owned them. The regional grocery chain, the mid-market hotel brand, the environmental consulting firm that held contracts with 6 provincial governments, the logistics company that moved pharmaceutical supplies across 4 provinces. Forbes Canada had mentioned Osei Capital Partners twice in passing, in articles about the Toronto business community. It had never published a profile. Kweku Osei did not give interviews. He did not attend galas. He did not appear on the covers of magazines. He sent his daughters to school under their own names and told them to be the sharpest people in any room they entered, and to let other people do the talking. Because people who talk too much always eventually say the thing they were trying to hide. Miriam had listened. She had also become a structural engineer, not a partner at her father's firm, not a philanthropic director or a board member with a ceremonial title, a working structural engineer, licensed in Ontario, with a specialty in heritage building rehabilitation. She had her own small consultancy, 4 employees, a client list that was growing steadily, and a reputation in the industry for solving problems that other firms called unsolvable. She had told Colin about her work on their 3rd date. She had not told him about her father. She had not told him about the portfolio. She had not told him about the fact that the building his company's headquarters occupied was owned through a trust administered by her father's counsel, by a holding company she had a 20% stake in. She had not told him because she had wanted to find out who Colin Whitmore was before she showed him what she was. 4 years later, she had her answer. Colin Whitmore was a partner at an architecture firm. He was charming and tall, and he had a laugh that filled rooms, and he had looked at Miriam on their first date, like she was the most interesting thing he had encountered in years. He asked questions. He remembered the answers. He showed up reliably for the first 18 months. Then his mother arrived. Pauline Whitmore was a retired school administrator from Oakville who treated her son's marriage the way a property manager treats a building that has been sold to an undesirable buyer. She did not object loudly. She did not make scenes. She simply began with the patience of someone who has time on her side to renovate the terms of Miriam's presence in the family. First, it was the holidays. Christmas in Oakville was non-negotiable, which Miriam accepted. But somehow Christmas in Oakville meant 2 days of Miriam in the kitchen while Colin watched hockey with his father and his brother, Theo, and his brother's girlfriend, a blonde woman named Cassidy who did not cook but was never asked to. Then it was the family group chat. Miriam was added to it 8 months after it was created. She discovered this when Colin's phone buzzed during dinner and she saw the thread name on his screen. When she asked why she hadn't been included, Colin said the chat was mainly for coordinating logistics. She wasn't missing anything. She asked what logistics. He said, family stuff. Then it was the decisions, the lake house booking, the family portrait for Pauline's 65th birthday, Theo's stag weekend, which Colin attended for 4 days without mentioning until the week before he left. These were presented as finished facts, accommodations for a woman who wasn't quite family enough to be consulted. Miriam noticed all of it. She said something about it twice. The first time, Colin told her she was being oversensitive, that Pauline was just set in her ways, that it was easier to just let things be. The second time, he told her she was making the family dynamic harder than it needed to be, and that he needed her to be supportive right now, because work was stressful. She was 7 months pregnant. She was running a consultancy. She had been managing their household finances, their mortgage payments, their insurance renewals, and the social calendar that kept Colin's professional network active since 6 months into their marriage. When Colin mentioned he'd never really been good at that kind of thing, and Miriam had simply, quietly, taken it over. She had filed both of these conversations in the same internal ledger where she filed everything. Dated, detailed, cross-referenced. She was her father's daughter. Colin's brother Theo was getting married to Cassidy in June. The rehearsal dinner was the 3rd week of April, held at the Fairmont in downtown Toronto, a venue that Miriam had known since she was 12 because her father used one of the private dining rooms for quarterly board meetings. She had not mentioned this. Pauline had organized the dinner. Miriam had not been consulted about the date, the venue, or the guest list. She had received a text from Colin 10 days before. Rehearsal dinner's the 18th. Mom wants us there at 6:30. She had been there at 6:25. She had been standing in the lobby at 6:31. The 45 minutes in the velvet chair were not the worst thing that had happened to her in 4 years of marriage. They were simply the clearest. There was something about the cream marble floor and the chandelier and the 19-year-old with his water glass that made the previous 4 years organize themselves into a shape she could finally see completely. She went home, added the note, took a shower, and made a phone call. Her father answered on the second ring. Miriam. He never said hello. He said her name, the way he always had, like the name itself was complete. I'm ready, she said. A pause. He had been waiting for this call for approximately 22 months, which was how long it had taken Miriam to be certain. Kweku Ose did not rush his daughter. He had learned, watching her mother, that a woman who moves when she is ready moves precisely. Tell me what you need, he said. Legal, financial, and I need someone to check the structural integrity of the Whitmore Group's current project on King Street. I have concerns. Another pause. Shorter this time. I'll have the team assembled by morning, he said. Are you safe? Yes, the baby? He's fine, Dad. She stopped. He watched her do it. He just turned and walked away. The silence on the line was the silence of a man who had once carried his daughter on his shoulders through a market in Accra and had spent the intervening 37 years making sure she would never need carrying again. I know, Kweku said quietly. We will handle this correctly. I know we will, Miriam said. I just needed you to know what he did. She heard him breathe. I know what he did, he said. I've known for a while. She didn't ask how. Her father had always known things at a distance that other people only learned up close. It was one of the reasons his firm had survived 4 recessions without a single year of losses. Get some sleep, he said. We start tomorrow. She did not sleep. She sat at her drafting table and reviewed 3 files she had been quietly assembling since the 2nd month of her marriage. When something in her engineer's brain had registered the structure of her situation and begun, automatically, cataloging load points. The first file contained documentation of every household expense she had managed and paid, in part or in full, for 39 months. The mortgage, which was in both their names, but whose payments she had structured after Colin's first large client left and his income dropped for 6 months. The utilities, the property taxes, the insurance, the groceries, the vet appointments for their cat, Biscuit, who was sitting on the corner of the drafting table now, watching her with the calm authority of a creature who has never doubted its own importance. The second file contained her professional records. 14 completed heritage rehabilitation projects. 3 currently active. A bid submission that had been shortlisted for a significant contract with the Ontario Heritage Trust. This file also contained the consulting agreement she had quietly negotiated through an intermediary with a structural assessment firm that was currently reviewing the foundation reports on the Whitmore Group's King Street development, the flagship project that Colin and his partner Neville had staked the firm's next 2 years on. Miriam had not manufactured problems with that project. She had not needed to. When she had seen the preliminary foundation specs in a document Colin left open on his laptop 3 months earlier, she had recognized the issue immediately. A heritage wall on the eastern face, categorized as non-load-bearing in the original assessment. It was load-bearing. She had spent 20 minutes with the building's original plans, cross-referenced with survey data from the 1970s renovation, and confirmed it without question. She had said nothing. She had taken photographs of the screen with her phone and added them to the second file. She was not going to let the building fall down. That was not how she operated. But she was going to make sure the correct people found the problem through the correct channels, which would mean a significant delay in the project's timeline, which would create a cash flow problem for the Whitmore Group, which would matter considerably during the period when a divorce was being negotiated. Engineering was at its core, the science of understanding where things fail. The third file was the one she had been hoping never to need. It contained a careful, documented account of 22 incidents over 40 months: the lobby, the group chat, the Christmas kitchen, the 4 days without a phone call, a birthday she had spent alone because Colin had forgotten. It was the same weekend as a golf trip he'd booked in February and didn't mention until April, a doctor's appointment at 16 weeks, where she had sat in the waiting room by herself because Colin had texted that morning to say his meeting was running long and she should go ahead. She had not cried at that doctor's appointment. She had held her phone in both hands, looking at the ultrasound image on the screen the technician had printed for her, and she had thought, "This child will have one parent who sees him complete. That is enough. That will be more than enough." She closed all 3 files. She looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked back at her with the slow, blinking serenity of a creature who has already decided everything is fine. "We're going to be all right," Miriam told him. Biscuit blinked once and went back to sleep. She called her assistant the next morning at 8 and cleared her afternoon. Then she drove to her father's office on Bay Street, took the elevator to the 14th floor, and sat down at a table with 2 family law attorneys, a forensic accountant, and Gerald Sutton, which was a name she recognized and which meant the situation had been elevated, because Gerald Sutton was her father's most senior counsel, and he did not attend preliminary meetings. "Tell us everything from the beginning," the lead attorney said. Miriam opened her laptop. She had organized the 3 files into a single presentation. It took 90 minutes. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Gerald Sutton, who was 63 and had been practicing law in Toronto since before Miriam was born, looked at the table for a moment and then said, in a tone that was neither impressed nor surprised but something more precise, "You documented everything." "I'm an engineer," Miriam said. "I document everything." He nodded once. "This will be straightforward." It was not, precisely, straightforward. But it was thorough, and thorough, Miriam had learned, was the only kind of thorough that held. The divorce petition was filed on a Tuesday. Colin received the notification via his attorney on Wednesday morning, which was also the morning that Whitmore Group received a letter from the structural assessment firm identifying a potential compliance issue with the King Street project's eastern load-bearing wall and requesting a suspension of work pending further review. Colin called Miriam's cell phone 4 times before noon. She did not answer. His calls were routed through a message her attorney had sent that morning to her legal team. Colin called Neville instead. She knew this because Neville's wife, Joanna, who had always been quietly kind to Miriam in the way of someone who notices things, but has chosen not to say them aloud, sent a text at 2 in the afternoon that said simply, "I'm sorry. I've known for a while that things weren't right. Please let me know if there's anything I can do." Miriam read the text twice. She wrote back, "Thank you, Joanna. That means more than you know." She meant it. Pauline called. Miriam did not answer. Pauline left a voicemail that was 14 minutes long and contained the words misunderstanding 7 times, and the word family 14 times, and the phrase "you have to understand that we love you" twice, which Miriam noted was the first time Pauline had used the word love in direct reference to her in 40 months of acquaintance. Cassidy, who was 3 weeks from her own wedding, texted Colin and not Miriam, which was the expected thing. Theo called Colin, and also not Miriam, which was also expected. The only unexpected call came from Colin's father, Raymond, who had always sat at the periphery of family events with a glass of scotch an expression of mild, resigned bewilderment, as though he had arrived at a party he hadn't been told was happening. Raymond called Miriam's cell on Thursday evening. She answered because he had been decent to her, specifically and consistently, in the small ways that matter. He had asked about her projects, remembered the names of buildings she'd worked on, congratulated her when the Heritage Trust shortlist was announced. "I want you to know," Raymond said, "that what Pauline did at that dinner was wrong, and that I said so at the time." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Did you?" She didn't listen. She rarely does. "But I want you to know I said it." "I appreciate that, Raymond. Is the baby all right?" "He's fine. Growing well." "Good." A pause. "Miriam, I'm sorry for all of it. The things I saw and didn't do enough about." It was the most honest sentence anyone in that family had spoken to her in 4 years. "I know," she said. "Thank you for calling." After she hung up, she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and biscuit on her lap and thought about Raymond Whitmore, this peripheral man with his scotch and his powerlessness, who had nonetheless managed to find her number and make the call. There was something in it. Not enough and too late, but something. She wrote it down in the Notes app. Not for the file, just because it seemed worth keeping. The Whitmore Group's King Street project went on hold for 11 weeks while the structural issue was assessed, redesigned, and submitted for reapproval. The delay pushed the project's completion date back 7 months. 2 anchor tenants exercised early termination clauses. The financing arrangement, which had been structured around an aggressive completion timeline, required renegotiation under less favorable terms. Miriam did not cause the structural issue. She did not manufacture the delay. She had identified a real problem in a real building and ensured it was reviewed by the appropriate professionals. She had saved a heritage wall from being incorrectly classified and potentially compromised. She had also, as a consequence of doing her job correctly, created conditions in which the Whitmore Group's financial position during the divorce proceedings was considerably weaker than it would otherwise have been. This was not revenge. This was engineering. Understanding where a system is underbuilt and letting reality do what it was always going to do. The divorce took 9 months to finalize. Miriam had moved into the brownstone she had purchased 3 years earlier under a trust name on a quiet street in Leslieville when she was 36 weeks pregnant. Her father had not suggested the brownstone. He had not offered to buy it. She had bought it herself from her own professional earnings because she had known, not hoped, not feared, but known, that she would eventually need a place that was entirely her own. Her son was born in June. 4 kilograms, healthy, dark-eyed, with a look of focused assessment that Miriam recognized immediately as something inherited. She named him Kofi. Her father held him for the first time in the hospital room and did not speak for a full minute, which was the longest Kweku Ose had been silent in Miriam's memory. "He has your mother's forehead," Kweku finally said. "I know," Miriam said. "She would have loved this very much." "I know that too." She settled Kofi into his bassinet beside her bed and looked at her father across the room, this compact, precise man who had built an empire quietly and raised 2 daughters to believe that quiet was not the same as small. And she felt the complicated weight of gratitude and inheritance and grief and determination that had no clean name in any language she knew, only a feeling like standing on very solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. The Ontario Heritage Trust contract was awarded to her consultancy 8 months after Kofi was born. It was the largest contract in the firm's history. Miriam negotiated the terms herself at a table on the 22nd floor of a government building. 7 weeks postpartum, with a breast pump in her bag and a binder of structural assessments that her team had spent 4 months preparing. The Heritage Trust's director, a woman named Odette who had been in the field for 30 years, looked at the binder and then looked at Miriam and said, "Your preliminary analysis on the Elgin Street warehouse is the most thorough documentation I've seen at this stage in 15 years. "Thank you," Miriam said. "We don't submit anything we can't stand behind completely." Odette nodded in a way that meant she understood the sentence had more than one meaning. The Heritage Trust contract was announced in a provincial press release. Miriam's consultancy was named. The release mentioned briefly her professional background and the firm's heritage rehabilitation record. It did not mention her father or OC Capital Partners. She had not asked it to, but the Toronto business community is not large, and the people who read the architectural press are often the same people who read the business press. And within a week of the announcement, People who had spent 4 years knowing Miriam O.C. Hargreaves as Colin Whitmore's quiet wife, who was an engineer of some kind, began to understand, piece by piece, that the woman they had been looking at, without seeing, was the daughter of Kweku, O.C., the principal of her own growing consultancy, and had just landed a contract that the Whitmore Group had quietly submitted a competing bid for and lost. She heard about this secondhand, from Joanna, who had maintained the friendship after the divorce with a steadiness that Miriam respected. "Neville keeps telling people you had an unfair advantage," Joanna said. They were having coffee in the Leslieville kitchen, Kofi asleep in the next room. "That the Heritage Trust knew about your family's connections. I submitted the same documentation every firm submitted," Miriam said, plus 40 additional pages of site analysis. "I know," Joanna said. "I told him that. He doesn't want to hear it. He never did." Joanna looked at her coffee. "No," she said. None of them did, really. They sat with that for a moment. "How's the baby sleeping?" Joanna asked. "Reasonably well," Miriam said. "He's quite interested in the ceiling fan. Stares at it for long periods with what I can only describe as professional assessment." Joanna laughed, genuinely, and the kitchen was briefly full of something that Miriam recognized as the feeling of being in a room where she was not being managed or accommodated or cataloged, but simply seen. She had spent 4 years forgetting what that felt like. She was relearning it, room by room. Colin reached out through his attorney twice after the divorce was finalized. The first time to ask about access arrangements for Kofi, which Miriam's attorney handled with precision and no ambiguity. The second time, 3 months later, with a message that read, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I understand if you don't want to respond. I just wanted you to know that I know I failed you. I didn't see what I had until it was gone." Miriam read the message on a Thursday evening. She was sitting on the back deck of the brownstone, Kofa asleep in a carrier against her chest, Biscuit occupying the chair to her left with his usual authority. The late October light was doing something complicated to the maple tree in the yard. She read the message twice, and she sat with it, and she let herself feel the sadness of it. Not for the marriage, which had shown her its true structure long before she left, but for the version of Colin she had believed existed on a Friday night in a bar when he had looked at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd encountered in years. That person, if he had ever been real, was worth mourning. She gave him a moment. Then she wrote back through her attorney. Thank her client for the message. "I've already forgiven him. Forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. I wish him well." She put the phone down. Kofi stirred against her chest, made a small investigating sound, and settled back into sleep. Biscuit looked at her from the adjacent chair with the patient, unconditional attention of a creature who has chosen its person and is not reconsidering. The maple tree held its complicated light. The city made its low, ambient sound in the middle distance. Somewhere in a building she had once assessed and helped restore, steel and stone were holding each other up the way she had designed them to, doing what they were built to do. Her father had told her once, after she submitted her engineering license application, that the most important skill in structural work was not calculation. It was the ability to look at something everyone else had accepted as finished and see where it was quietly failing. To understand, before the cracks showed on the surface, what was happening in the foundation. She had learned it from blueprints. She had applied it to her marriage. She had walked away before the collapse and built something new on ground she had chosen herself, on terms she had drawn up, in a structure that no one else's indifference could undermine. Kofi opened his eyes. He looked up at her with the focused, wondering attention he brought to all new things, this small person who had arrived into the world in the same season she had finished rebuilding hers. And she looked back at him with the steadiness of a woman who knows exactly what she's made of and what she's made. The quietest engineer in the room is not always the one following someone else's design. Sometimes she's the one who drew the plans,